Gaia. The beginning of time, I was there. All life comes from me. And now I'm sitting on the side of a mountain in Delphi, watching what once was mine. My life is vibrant. All things come from me. All things return to me. I am black, but I am fertile. I remember Delphi. Oh, the trees reaching to the sky and the climbing vines yielding such rich fruit. And below, the flowers scattered all over the ground, and my priestesses walking among the trees and helping people, even healing people. It was an amazing time. So beautiful. So much me. I was the one who gave the oracles. The voice of Chthoniah. That was me. The mantic oracles I gave to give people wisdom. They used the word Chthoniah in the end for all the goddesses of the underworld. Hecate, Demeter. They used it as a degradation. They put them down. They made them evil. But we were once alive and good. I gave some of my power to Themis. And the account of those times is in a long poem called Eumolpia by Messias. Themis, sadly, chose to hand the power over to Apollo. Just like my adopting Zeus, it was a very grave mistake. It was a sad time. The towers started to rise above the trees. They even cut down the trees to build towers. The trees were quite confused. There had never been towers there before. They had been the towers. They even put slabs over the top of some of the plants. I was a little encouraged when I discovered there was going to be a woman at the middle of it all. I thought maybe it would be one of my priestesses, and that she would offer wisdom like the priestesses had, and indeed I had. Then I realized she was going to be put underground. I smelt the burning of the herbs, and I realized that these were hallucinogens. So she was going to be confined under the ground, uttering gibberish. The men would interpret what she said, only for other men. It was the worst degradation of women. Civilization overtook nature, indeed built over nature. The women were regarded as irrational, not surprisingly, if you kept them underground with hallucinogens all the time. And that was the end of my power. I was a little encouraged when I saw the temple start to fall. And I heard there was a new religion with a man-god at the centre. A man-god rather like Apollo, really. I thought, this is it. From making things rise to the sky, forgetting me down here, and looking up at the sky for everything, I'd hoped that they would find me again in this new religion. I looked down into the valleys, but the spires and the domes of the churches rose high. and the stone slabs covered the earth as they had in the temple of Apollo. So I sat on my mountain and I watched and I waited. It was a new religion, it seemed to me, happening on Apollo's bit. It was called tourism. Many of them came, and the buildings were now falling. And you know, as the buildings fell, my little vines started to climb over the top. Some of the tourists even noticed the flowers growing at the foot of these little stones. Maybe one day they will return to me. Maybe that is the beginning, the tourists who find a little flower. I live in hope. Here she is in various manifestations of Gaia, from the ancient Greek statue to more contemporary ones, Gaia with the earth in her belly, and of course James Lovelock with all the work he's done on the Gaia hypothesis. So there she is in various shapes and sizes. She runs behind all of our story in Europe. She is an ancestor of Europe, and she still sits there underneath that European culture, probably waiting and hoping. This is what we're going to look at today. We've seen the prelude and look at all these movements through the dirty descent into heaven. The pandemic. Time changed, didn't it, in the pandemic? And we had a little time, at least initially, before we got used to Zoom, to sit in the garden. There is a stillness deep down things today. I can nearly hear the worms' journeyings and the wriggling of the tardigrades in the water butt. The curving edges of the sky clouds are no longer straightened by cross lines, and the fountain burbles an undertone. The falling catkins noiselessly pattern the sun-mottled lawn, and the scrabble of the squirrels offers a too loud rattle in the pianissimo symphony. The burgeoning green leaves will soon be big enough to rustle. Finely tuned branches perform a graceful dance of varying rhythms over the bench on which I sit. All is at rest, and I long to join. I wrote that last April in the garden, aware of how little time I had spent before on listening to the sounds of nature. The earthy sounds which we musicians have used for a long time. The rattle of the nuts from the South American tree. We forget that our flutes were originally tree branches. This one looks remarkably like it. Perhaps hasn't got the penetration of a flute over the commercial flutes of our day. We forget that our musical instruments came from the earth, even if they're a bit more refined from the beautiful metallic ores that we have refined. Or even like the beautiful bowls that we get from Nepal. And sitting at home now, I have 6 big quartz bowls like this, making the most beautiful sounds of different levels, made from the byproducts of the computer industry in making the quartz crystals. There are byproducts which are now made into these glorious bowls, which you can see at the bottom there, the rose quartz. They're used now for healing. If you want healing on the internet, just go into singing quartz bowls, and you will find that you can sit for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours and be engulfed by these beautiful sounds. And if you hear Geraldine talking about them, she says how the earth through these bowls is healing us. These are all earth bowls being used for us to heal. Maybe we can hear the earth just a little in the bowls. Bernie Krause's beautiful book, The Great Animal Orchestra, shows how human beings have drowned out the earth. He defines sounds into 3 kinds. Anthrophony, which is our sounds, some of it's called music, but some of it's called car sounds and sirens. Geophony, the sounds of the earth, the wind, the waves, and biophony, the sounds made by animals. Once upon a time, we wouldn't have been able to exclude those any more than we could last night, where the birds joined us, joined the harp, and joined the singing. Before human beings learned to build enclosed buildings, they were always open to that area. So for much of human history, we always had to blend with the geophony and the biophony. But now we can build solid walls, we cut them out. We even build soundproof studios so that they don't intrude on our recordings. Why would we do that? Why is the sound of human beings so much more important than the sound of the birds? If you have the courage, try and imitate the sound of the bird. You'll find it will respond. It's an interesting and beautiful exercise to do. So we see increasing anthrophony. We see that rising red line where human sounds are increasingly blotting out the sounds of the earth and animals. And we see a soundscape there, the sort of soundscape that we're familiar with, where they do blend. And I love poems which blend it. Isn't this beautiful? Slish, 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 slish. It's a splendid poem, isn't it? We can all write poems like that, I think, if we listen to the natural world. And I think the mud may respond to us as to that child in the picture. Science is telling us is that the world is vibrating, all of us, all of it. The earth, space is not empty, there are vibratory codes everywhere. The Greeks called it ether, sometimes love. Ether was the essence of the divine, God, the basis of matter. This moves into the notion of the Holy Spirit with Christianity, and then on to Descartes with space filled with substance propagating electromagnetic and gravitational forces vibrating. Newton develops it, and now we see quantum physics locating it in a zero-point field. And we see some of the people who've looked at the quantum physics of it all. But more significantly, I love the notion of the zero-point field. The zero-point field is the place from which all possibilities, all options, basically everything originates. It's like the cosmic drawing board, a place where your soul can try out any experience you would like. It's a place to find yourself, the truth and the heart of creation from your point of view. It's all about your experience and transmuting the suffering aspects into a higher vibration, such as joy. That is where quantum physics is now, and this means that musicians have in their hands, and we all have in our hands, speech and language, and that means that all of that needs to be done with the notion of love, because what we're doing is playing with the vibratory structure of the universe. There is no silence in the universe. There is only vibration. That's all there is. And what we call silence is simply just reducing the level of noise. If we were given real silence, which people are in an anechoic chamber, we go mad, because we need the sound, because the vibration is the life of the universe. That takes us, of course, to Hildegard and Viriditas. Viriditas is the greening power which Hildegard saw running through everything, maybe vibration, even the earth. The earthworm is very hot. It grows in the same aridity in which grasses begin to sprout. It grows in that noisy greenness, and because of its clean nature, it has no bones. It is good and useful, like other useful things such as cinnamon. Earth has moisture in it, which is contained in something like veins, so it does not flow out. When the rain is about to fall from the air, this moisture feeds the coming rain, which will fill its veins. The earthworms understands this replenishing of the earth's veins and come forth. So we have the notion of redeeming animals that we've often put down, and that the earthworm runs as like a trope through this presentation. I love the earthworm. So Hildegard saw the earth as having many powers in it, various types of soil, which may be green, white, black, or red, each with a blended balance of moisture and dryness, warmth and coldness, that she called sweat and moisture and juice. And of course she saw strengthening love, blooming in everything. This is one of her antiphons, at her most excellent in the deeps and the rising stars, and the most fascinating heart of all things, because she has embraced the highest sovereign in peace. Isn't that like 0 Point Field, expressed in a medieval way? And it's not just in the heavens, which is what we've tended to do, it's excellent in the deeps, as well as the rising stars, and the fascinating heart of all things. She lived in an age where we were much more strongly connected with the earth than we are now. The age of the doctrine of the humors, drawing on the writings of Hippocrates. So everything consists of a mixture of fire, the yellow at the top, earth, the black, water, the blue, and blood, the air. And you can see this was linked with various bits of the body, and linked with us. Each of us is either a prevalent hot, or prevalent dry, or prevalent cold, or prevalent wet. And if you were a doctor in those days, and first of all you had to work out whether the person in front of you was a fiery or an earthy or a watery person, then you had to look at the weather. Because if you were a watery person on a hot day like today, you wouldn't be very happy. You'd be happier on a rainy day. So your prescription bore in mind the environment as well as the person themselves. And this takes us quite clearly to Sally MacFade's, asking whether one way to re-mythologize the gospel for our time might not be through a metaphor of God's body rather than the king's realm. When the world is viewed as God's body, the body that includes more than just Christians and more than just human beings. This, of course, she's drawing on some of these visions of Hildegard. Here we see cosmic humanity, we see the head of God at the top, and then we see the body of God with the human being in it. So there is nothing which is outside of God. Everything is God's body. And then a wonderful portrayal of the entanglement of the universe, where the seasons and the fire and the water are all held together in some sort of unity. So it was only really at the so-called Enlightenment, which I prefer to see as not a very good idea, when we lost that interconnection, which children have, of course. I found some lovely mud poems. I love mud, 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 mud. Ishi, gishy, super squashy, mud, 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 and so on. And at the end, I love to squish, I love to squash it. I don't know why we have to wash it. So, and of course, I was brought up in the country, so we didn't wash it a lot. We were always rolling in it and exploring it in a way that seems to be anathema for children today. I'm not quite sure why. But that muddy poem at the end, oh, there, where we have a 7-year-old, I think it is, digging the garden with a spoon. And the last verse, mixing and kneading, I felt the earth rise and move beneath my fingers, slippery and elastic, as a loaf of black bread in the making. It was the first time I think I saw it was a live thing. Isn't that lovely? It was a live thing. The earth is a live thing. So, how did we lose it? What were we doing? Let me just have one last poem before we leave it. It's one of Mary Oliver's, and you'll find Mary Oliver's poems going through this a lot. It's called From the Pink Moon, the Pond. You step off the shore and plummet to your knees, you slog forward to your thighs and sink to your cheekbones, and now you are caught by the cold chains of water. You are vanishing while around you the frogs continue to sing, driving their music upwards through your own throat, not even noticing you as someone else. And that's when it happens. You see everything through their eyes, their joy, their necessity. You wear their webbed fingers, your throat swells, and that's when you know you will live, whether you will or not, one way or another, because everything is everything else, one long muscle. Isn't that lovely? The whole earth is one long muscle. It's a marvellous poem, as much of Mary Oliver's stuff is. So, soil flight. When did we fly from the soil? So we flew, we have that wretched English word drit, which we call dirt, which also meant excrement. That wasn't very helpful with connotations we now associate with dirt, deadness and disease. But here we have the good soil. 10 million bacteria, tens of thousands protozoa, 1,000s of nematodes, a rounded proportion of the average 250 worms per square metre. Scores of kilometres of almost invisible microscopic roots, hundreds of insects and soil mites, unknown billions of viruses, but there are 100 trillion bacteria living in an adult body. Most are the very same ones that are found in the soil. So how can we say that the soil is lifeless, and so on? That notion. And yet we flew from it, thinking that it was dirty, contained excrement, and was not alive. So we have the rise now of soil science, which we see in two shapes. Pedology, the science of the soil genesis. This is very much the traditional science, classifying and distributing. But one which I think is best for us to look at, and that's edaphology, the influence soils have on all living things, and on the use humans make of the soil and the land more generally. But since the Reformation, theology lost touch with a meaningful awareness of the soil or earth. So I think that we need to create an edaphotheology, theology of the relationship of human beings with the soil. And I love this soil scientist, Francis Hole, who I've only just met, really. He calls himself Francis Hole TNS, temporarily not soil. Isn't that lovely? TNS, temporarily not soil. He was a songwriter, and a lovely account of him here. We walked down the road a bit with Dr. Hole in the lead, playing his fiddle and singing songs, extolling the glories and mysteries of soil. Suddenly he stopped playing, halting the march. He had us take off our shoes and socks and step barefoot out onto the prairie soil, and he sang, "Darkle, darkle, little grain, I wonder how you entertain 1,000 creatures microscopic, grains like you from pole to tropic, support land life upon this planet, I marvel at you, crumb of granite." There we are. Temporarily not soil. So here we have what we've got: soil biota, feeding off decaying material, roots with water, minerals transformed, water and carbon, nourishing the soil with nourishment, single living integrated community. Integrated community, working alongside each other. A non-hierarchical matrix of interconnectivity and life-generating relationality, self-sustaining diversity of life, and a generous hospitality to each living component without distinction. The soil is hospitable. It takes everything, transforms it all the time. And this wonderful description of what an earth democracy by the Indian writer Vandana Shiva, this is her description of what an earth democracy would look like. All species have intrinsic worth. The earth community is a democracy of all life. Diversity in nature and culture must be defended. All beings have a natural right to sustenance. Earth democracy is based on living economies and economic democracy. Living economies are built on local economies. Earth democracy is a living democracy. Earth democracy is based on living cultures. Living cultures are life-nourishing. Earth democracy globalizes peace, care, and compassion. And it's concerned about mutual flourishing, really. They all will flourish. And that kinship with the environment. I think the worst thing that we ever invented was the notion of animate and inanimate. If we had not invented that, we could never have done to the earth what we've done to it. The traditional African cultures would be amazed that we could even imagine that there's anything which has not a soul. Totally beyond their comprehension. And this particular writing is from an indigenous Native American. Did you know trees talk? Well, they do. They talk to each other and they'll talk to you if you listen. Trouble is, white people don't listen. They never learn to listen to the Indians, so I don't suppose they'll listen to other voices in nature. But I've learned a lot from trees, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about animals, sometimes about the Great Spirit. I think that Western people who come into an Indian environment and attempt to preach take along their own set of categories and use it to deal with the Indian people they meet. Anthropologists, summarising what they find in the Indian tradition, always call us animists, and that view is accepted by a great many people in the field of religion. We are put in a cultural evolutionary framework, and then we are supposed to move from animism to some great abstract conception of one God. Science describes things at the level of abstraction by leaving out of account a whole range of properties that they have: colour, beauty, and consciousness. And again, I'm resorting to Mary Oliver with a wonderful poem called Some Questions You Might Ask. Is the soul solid, like iron, or is it tender and breakable, like the wings of a moth and the beak of the owl? Who has it, and who doesn't? I keep looking around me. The face of the moose is as sad as the face of Jesus. The swan opens her white wings slowly. In the fall, the black bear carries leaves into the darkness. One question leads to another. Does it have shape, like an iceberg, like the eye of a hummingbird? Does it have one lung, like the snake and the scallop? Why should I have it and not the anteater who loves her children? Why should I have it and not the camel? Come to think of it, what about the maple tree? What about the blue iris? What about the little stones sitting along in the moonlight? What about roses and lemons and their shining leaves? What about grass? The questions that you might ask. And that notion that everything has a soul and that our education systems have lost a sense of everything having a soul. How could we do the dissection that we do if we believed that? And the notion that many educationalists are writing about, the education should be concerned with what they call the environmental commons and the cultural commons. This is an interesting one for Holyrood, because the environmental commons are places which are open to the public, whatever, like the meadows and the stream. The cultural commons are places like Holyrood Garden, which are open sometimes to the public and are curated in some way or other. So, and in fact, this particular set of educationists writing make the point churches could play a similar role, especially as they own a great deal of land, and which is owned by the public through the church. So a shifting of egocentric purposes of theological training to one focused on gaining systemic wisdom, where learning is orientated towards understanding and acknowledging the ways in which we interact with, depend upon, and impact a larger system of intelligence. And here's a philosopher debating how we got into this mess. A human and the seagull and the fish and the worm, each of them equipped to perceive the world in ways that I am not. The world supports irreconcilable perceptions of all of us: fish, beetles, birds, people. The world supports all of these simultaneously. And for each experiencer shows that none of us has, nor could have, even in principle, anything more than a minutely partial experience of the world. How have we claimed that we know more than the bird? On what even scientific basis can we make that claim? We cannot make it, and we have made it over and over and over again. So to rediscover that seems to me unbelievably important. I come from the generation where there was also a great fear of the end of the world. It was indeed the bomb, the atom bomb. So many of my contemporaries chose not to have children because it was all going to be, we were going to blow the whole thing up. So we had a similar apocalyptic vision then. But our answer was interesting, that we go off into space. That's why we had space travel. We could blow this lot up, we'd all go off on our space things, and it would all be all right. What we didn't actually realise, there's in our spaceship, we have to have air, because we can't manage without it. We have to have food, which contains the earth, because we can't manage without it. We have to have water, because we're 80% water. And we have to have a bit of warmth, because we can't adapt to those. So we had to take whole chunks of the earth with us, because we're inextricably bound up with the earth. It was a terrible myth, and it still is in the space travel world, that that's what we can do. We can't. We are inextricably bound up, and we have to take bits of it with us all the time. And this is a machine that I'm just about to buy. This is an Italian one. It's been around for 20 or 25 years, that electronodes are put on the plants, which then turn the vibrations from the plants into sounds and can be heard. So the notion that everything is singing and everything is making music of some kind or another. And I love this piece of writing. Human beings may separate things into many parts as we wish, separating spirit from flesh, sacred from secular, church and world. We should not be surprised when God does not recognise the distinctions we make between the two. Earth is so thick with divine possibility, there's a wonder we can walk anywhere without cracking our shins on altars. So we've gone away from the earth with the result that we've made everything up as good. Why is heaven up and hell down? Since the Reformation, Western thinking and theology has little meaningful awareness, as we've seen. So I've been inventing earth angels. Why do angels live in the sky and have wings? Why can't we have badger angels, like that one in the corner there? Is that an angel? Why cannot hell be in the sky? It has been in the sky for quite a lot of people, in the form of aeroplanes dropping bombs, and so on. So why is heaven up there and hell down there? Why did those earth goddesses get, from being vibrant goddesses of life, become populating witches of hell? And where did that happen along the way? And those of you who were brought up, as I was, on Cecily Mary Barker's Flower Fairies, everybody, yes, a lot of people were. Cecily Mary Barker was doing flower fairies on the one hand and commissioned pictures for the Sunday school on the other. And if you look carefully, the flower fairies are not a lot different from angels, really. So we lost them. We had all the earth creatures. We had goblins, we had kelpies, we had fairies. We ditched that lot, and we just kept the angels, well, sort of. And so we lost all the beautiful associations of holy figures and life-giving figures which belonged in the earth. And we've carried on doing that all the way along the line. We substituted abstraction for the real thing. And some of us remember Tillich and Co. and God as the ground of being. We didn't actually mean that. It was a sort of abstraction from it. And Catherine Keller have reduced the earthiness of ground as source of life to mere abstract theological ideas about origin and foundation, deterritorialized, uprooting themselves from the ground. Earth is far too dirty for revelation. Soil is never the matter of a divine epiphany, and so on. So let's look at the resurrection of Jesus, which potentially could have solved all of this. Jesus rests in the tomb, but ultimately ascends. He was born in the darkness of his mother's womb, so he was resurrected, but let's not regard it as a resurrection. He was reborn in the darkness under the earth. He had to go into the cave. Because in the cave were all his ancestors. As Maya Angelou writes at the beginning of her wonderful poem on the Pulse in the Morning, a rock, a river, a tree, host of species long departed, marked the mastodon, the dinosaur, who left dried tokens of their sojourn here on our planet floor. So Jesus was resting in a cave made of the remains of mastodons and dinosaurs all there. So he goes back into that cave. He needed to go back into that cave in order to be reborn. Jesus is born again in earth, the revelatory nature of the subterranean darkness of the soil or earth. We don't see much of the cave, do we? It's always that sort of image of the resurrection, isn't it? Leaving it all behind. But there are more contemporary ones which see more of a joining of earth and heaven. There's another love of resurrection where it's seen really as a resurrection in the form of trees. Another one, earth teaches us resurrection. And reborn as the earth, the world as God's body. And a much more enfleshed one, which I hope you'll like, Elizabeth, an embodied resurrection. Isn't that splendid? You can't get a much more embodied resurrection than that. Stanley Spencer, The Awakening. And so we see that Maya Angelou carries on. Here, root yourself beside me. I am the tree planted by the river, which will not be moved. I the rock, I the river, I the tree, I am yours. Your passages have been paid. Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Isn't that beautiful? History, if faced with courage, need not be lived again. That's Maya Angelou, who many of us look to for the sense of resurrection. And that notion that it is in the natural world and the other than human world that we see this famous quotation, there are known knowns, there are things we know, there are known unknowns, that is to say there are things that we now know we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things that we do not know, we don't know. Nature confronts us with that all the time. And I love this from Robert Frost. I write to find out what I didn't know I knew. Isn't that lovely? And I'm going to move touch very briefly on the book of Job, because Job, having cursed the day on which he was born, as he's recovering from that experience, God actually initiates the recovery by showing him the wonders of the natural world. There's William Blake's portrayal of Behemoth and so on. And this is what Blake writes, God showing Job the incredible wonders of the universe, touching two magnificent creatures. Of Behemoth he saith he is the chief of the ways of God. Of Leviathan he saith he is the king over all the children of pride. Can any understand the spreading of the clouds, the noise of his tabernacle? So Job is redeemed by seeing that he is part of a much larger, very mysterious structure. And when he's seen that, the morning stars sing together, and so on. The world is seen as wonderful. Elizabeth hinted at that yesterday. A change in us is as much in the world for the wanderer, if we can only wonder. The change in the world is radical. Wonder does not isolate the extraordinary. In wonder, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. And Lawrence writing that the sense of wonder, that is the sixth sense, it is the natural religious sense. Here we see another wonderful Stanley Spencer picture. Jesus in the desert looking at the flowers. Isn't that beautiful? What a marvellous, I mean, Lisa would love it, a fat Jesus, right down on the earth, and so on. But this is the notion of the crucifixion, which I love. It looks much more centred in the earth. I've used the geophany. If you remember at the crucifixion, we have the earth trembling and the eclipse and all of that. I think that picture, tiny one, shows, you know, the sort of agony in it. So I wore my T-shirt. Hello, darkness, my old friend. Because it's been the misinterpretation of light that's actually let us down rather badly. I am the light of the world misinterpreted, not to mention John's letters, and that pursuit of light relentlessly in them. Because the earth is dark, dark and damp, the matrix preparing its ancestral, and there we have all the wonderful sorts of soil. We've got the igneous rock from the volcanoes, the sedimentary like chalk, with the exoskeletons of our ancestors buried, and the metamorphic, all those different sorts of soil. There is a mystery beneath us, and that's the sort of thing we've got, a deep biosphere which we scarcely know anything about. With masses of microorganisms, and then a calving layer of fragmented disintegrating rock, then the subsoil with nutrients and minerals, then a topsoil drawing water down, and then the surface, the humus. Mysterious mulching decay. I love mulching. Mulching is what we do to things and then they become fertile again, and so on. And a constant interplay. That's the life of the soil. All of those areas interacting with one another. And of course, if we remember the quotations, which many of us know, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. I'm reminded of John Hull, who said that he was asked to be blind in order to learn that. That's what he was being shown in his blindness. And you know, many of you know that I hate this hymn, "Thou whose almighty word chaos and darkness heard and took their flight," rubbish. So, thine be the glory. Some of you will know this is my Easter version of it. Christ our companion, gloriously alive. We can share your darkness. We can share your life. We need to share both, not just one of them. And reclaiming the darkness, dark in the dawn of time, dark in the sheltering room, dark in the heart's deep cells. In the shamanic tradition, under the earth, it's the healing place. If you want to be healing, you go under the earth with the shaman. You go to the healing pools, and that's where you'll find your ancestors, and you'll be healed. You'll find your guides and all of that, looking at a different theological frame from the Christian one. But there, under the earth, is healing. Not hell, but healing. And we have this wonderful poem, which I really read very little bit of, about Jesus. The ancient greyness shifted, this is in the tomb, suddenly and thinned like mist on the moors before the wind. An old prophet lifted a shining face and said he will be coming soon. Then one old man who had not stirred in this entry remembered home. There he was, the Son of God, splendid in the morning sun, as only God is fair. And they, confused with joy, knelt to adore, seeing he wore crimson scars. No canticle at all was sung, none toned a psalm. A silent man alone of all that throng found tongue, not any other close to his heart when the embrace was done. Old Joseph said, "How's your mother? How's your mother, son?" Isn't that lovely? That there was Joseph waiting for Jesus, the ancestors waiting down there. And of course, very powerful in that particular one, the notion of the ancestors in Wilfred Owen's amazing poem, Strange Meeting, which many of you will know from the end of Britain's War Requiem, where they meet, two soldiers meet face to face. "Strange friend," I said, "here is no cause to mourn." "None," said the other, "save the undone years. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in this dark, for so you frowned yesterday when you jabbed and killed. I parried. My arms were loath and cold. Let us sleep now that the two enemies met." So that notion of the healing pools, the deep healing pools under the earth, strange meeting and so on. And that dying and living are not separate. They are part of the same. Dying and giving birth go on inside one consciousness, but most people misunderstand the pure play of creative energy, how inside that, those are one event. And of course the earth shows us that. We end in the earth and we are reborn in some shape or form. And the earth, you see, brings new life from ruins. Just as Gaia said at the beginning. I watched on the old A30 from between Basingstoke and Winchester, the massive hotel, now up for sale. Nobody bought it because the M3 was on the other side of the wood. It fell into ruins. It fell into ruins. Now, a field has just gone straight over the top of it. You would never even know that there was a hotel there. The earth is completely embraced, straight back. So you see these lovely pictures of new life from the ruins and so on. You see the old abbey with the trees growing, and I love the one where the trees growing up the side of the ruined house. Absolutely wonderful. As I was a child, Southampton had been heavily bombed in the war. And everywhere, what I remember as a child was Rose Bay Willow Herb. All the buildings, the ruined buildings, were filled with Rose Bay Willow Herb. And so, the earth can bring new life, and does. And there we have this wonderful poem by Philip Larkin. With the last verse, yet still the unresting castles thresh in full ground thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. Even lamenting. And I love this blessing from Mary Oliver. I don't want you to just sit down at the table. I don't want you to just eat and be content. I want you to walk out into the fields where the water is shining and the rice has risen. I want you to stand there, far from this white tablecloth. I want you to fill your hands with mud, like a blessing. So a blessing with mud in it. I think that's a good idea. And just as a postlude, I did look at a dirt-filled church and what we've lost. And I wrote a new hymn for this. Sing a song of whirling worms, deep within our mud-soaked soil, wellspring of our verdant sea, processing with endless toil. Tell your stories, crawling ones, circling round the roots and rocks, as you green the land above. Hidden wisdom is unlocked, ancient healing cavern pools, underworld of dust and dark. Turn detritus into gold, substance of the bear and lark. In the tunneling of God's grace, we are rooted deep in earth. Smear us with your dirt and grit, for in darkening God gives birth. So the church in general has had trouble with it, and I'm going to read a poem. I was alone in the church. The vaults curved above me, and I heard a scratching on the roof, under the floor, on the door, and all the windows, and there was a rushing mighty wind, and a figure flew in. I had not seen one like her before, for her flame filled the temple, and her skirt flowed with serpents. Her hair was filled with honeysuckle and old man's beard. Frogs leaped from her mouth and played gambolling around the statues. They found the font, and the figure sprayed water from her toes, and the font filled. The frogs laughed and spewed out tadpoles. I saw that the floor was becoming transparent. I could see the traversing worms, the burrowing beetles, the termites, and the ants. And then I noticed the roof was filling with birds. They were attached to the strings in her hair. Branches were growing out of the walls, and suddenly a fully grown oak leaped out of the floor. No sooner was it born than the ivy started to wind itself around the trunk. And then I saw people were emerging from her belly. Every shape, every age, they hopped, they jumped, they crawled, they limped, they lay in her arms and started to find places in the corners of the church. And I noticed that she was a woman, struggling to give birth to all these creatures, for some were minute and some were huge. They contained every rainbow colour. Some were still and some moved. Some appeared to be made of wood and stone, and the winding ivy and the honeysuckle fronds bound them together. "Who are you?" I said, enveloped in the swirling of the multifarious creatures, and she replied, "I am the wild goddess. Thank you for letting me in. I have been waiting outside for so long." She raised her hands and vines circled from them, dropping grapes, and all were trodden by the wheelchairs, ploughing over them. The juice flowed into the silver cups which were appearing everywhere, shaped from buttercups and daffodils, and all drank together. "I am called Joy," she said, and we all laughed, and the sound fill the temple. And we'll have the wonderful Song of Gladness, which Michael Morpurgo wrote, which is a beautiful example of the world singing, and a notion that we can all sing. Some of you will know that Michael Morpurgo also had a long COVID, and this poem was actually made in that long COVID.
A Song of Gladness. I've been talking every morning to Blackbird, telling him why we are all so sad at the moment. He sits on his branch and listens. It was Blackbird's idea. He sang out this morning at dawn from his treetop in the garden, to Fox, half asleep behind the garden shed. She thought it a good idea too. It was a wake-up call. Fox was on her feet at once and trotting through Bluebell Wood, where she barked it to deer, who ran off across the stream. Kingfisher was there, otter and dipper too. They heard and piped it on, and swallow swooped down over the meadow and passed it on to cows waiting to go into their milking, and to sheep resting quietly under the hedge with her lambs in a corner of the dew-damp field. And they all agreed, bleating it out to bees already busy at their flowers, to weaving spiders and grasshoppers and scurrying mice. Trees heard sheep calling too, the whole flock of them, and waved their budding leaves in wild enthusiasm. And high above, the clouds wandered through the skies, driven by wind, and wind took Blackbird's idea over the cliffs across heaving seas, where gulls and albatross cried it out, and whales and dolphins and porpoises heard it, and wailed and whooped it down into the deep, where turtles listened, and they too loved the idea. So did plankton, and every fish and crab and sea urchin and whelk. They all whispered it was a fine notion, the best they ever heard. And the whisper went over the sea on the curling waves to the shores of Africa, where lions roared their approval and elephants trumpeted it. Leopards yawned it, water buffalo belched it, wild dogs yelped it. Wildebeest murmured it out across the savannah, and storm lifted the idea up over rainforests, where rain took it and poured it down on gorillas in the mist, on chimpanzees in their sleeping nests. Howler monkeys and gibbons echoed their calls loud over all the earth. They are that loud. And then, from far up high, Sun heard it too and shone it down over deserts, where Oryx stamped her foot impatient to be getting on with it and doing it. She loved the idea that much. Even Camel, who rarely joined in anything, thought this was the best and most beautiful idea he had ever heard. Back in the garden, Blackbird waited till everyone was ready, and then he began to sing. And the whole carnival of animals, every living thing on this good earth, joined in, until the globe echoed with the joy of it, and Blackbird was very pleased. But I was still lost in sadness, as I heard the earth singing around me. It was a song of forgiveness, I knew that. So I asked Blackbird if I could join in, and he sang his answer back to me. "Why do you think we are doing this, you silly man? We want you and yours to be happy again. Only then will you treat us and the world right again, as you know you should. Only then will all be well. Sing, silly man, sing, sing. Our song is your song. Your song is our song." We all sang away our sadness. In every house and flat and cottage we clapped and sang, in every hut and tent, in every palace and hospital and prison. And they heard and we heard our song of gladness echoing all together in glorious harmony across the universe.